Good morning. Am I coming in clear?
Yes po, Doc.
All right. So, I'm Dr. Brenda Bernadette Bautista Zamora. I'm an OBGYN and my subspecialty is maternal fetal medicine. Our lecture for today will be on primary and secondary dysmenorrhea, together with a topic on premenstrual syndrome and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. All right. So let me show you our objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to define primary and secondary dysmenorrhea and premenstrual syndrome and your premenstrual dysphoric disorder. You should be able to describe the various clinical presentations of these various conditions. You should be able to identify their risk factors, their causes, and be able to correlate these with the pathophysiology. At the end of the lecture, you should be able to establish the pathway to the differential diagnosis and actual diagnosis. And at the end, you would be able to review treatment and management options of primary and secondary dysmenorrhea and your premenstrual syndrome and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So I've already submitted your exam questions and they will be verbatimly lifted from this lecture. Let me show you the outline. So we'll start off with dysmenorrhea, and then secondary dysmenorrhea, and then lastly, the topic put together, your premenstrual syndrome and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Let's start off with the definition. Dysmenorrhea. So dysmenorrhea is a cyclic, it's a painful cramping sensation over the lower abdomen that is often accompanied by other biologic symptoms. And what are these symptoms? These women would complain also of sweating, tachycardia, headaches, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and sometimes tremulousness, all occurring before or during the menses. So what's the difference between primary and secondary dysmenorrhea? For primary dysmenorrhea, this refers to pain with no obvious pathologic pelvic disease. It's currently recognized that these patients are suffering from the effects of endogenous prostaglandins, and almost always first occurs in women younger than age 20. These women would report of pain as soon as they establish ovulatory cycles. Now, on the other hand, you have secondary dysmenorrhea. This is due to pelvic pathologic conditions, and this occurs in adolescents and in women of any age. Let's talk about incidence and epidemiology. As to prevalence, it's wide range. They say between 16 to 90%. And this is based on studies on students, teenagers, and their mothers, as well as individuals from various specific populations, like when they conduct studies among college students or in the workplace. But the estimate would be about 75%. Okay. Lined up here, direct your attention to your left are the risk factors that may increase the risk of developing dysmenorrhea. Listed below are age younger than 30, a BMI less than 20, prolonged duration of menses, irregular or heavy menses, premenstrual syndrome, pelvic inflammatory disease, sterilization, history of sexual assault, heavy smoking, or family history, particularly if their mother or a sister has dysmenorrhea as well. Now, direct your attention to the right side of the screen. Risk factors that may reduce the risk of developing dysmenorrhea. You have younger age at first childbirth, those with higher parity, those are with physical exercise and are on oral contraceptive pills. Question: is there a relationship to menstruation and the menstrual cycle? There is significant positive correlation among the severity of dysmenorrhea and the following: duration of the menstrual flow, the amount of the menstrual flow, and if there was early menarche. Now, the severity of dysmenorrhea has no relationship with the actual duration of the menstrual cycle. Let's start off with primary dysmenorrhea. As to pathogenesis, the pathogenesis of dysmenorrhea is that of elevated prostaglandin F2 alpha and your E2 levels in the secretory endometrium, resulting in uterine hypercontractility and thus leading to the symptoms of severe cramping. If you take a look at the diagram on your right, you start off with a corpus luteum regression. When there is no pregnancy, you have your decrease in progesterone, and then eventually the menstrual flow. What comes with the menses? Increased prostaglandins, the endoperoxidases, and the metabolites. This would induce increased myometrial contractions, dysrhythmia at that, with note of reduced blood flow and ischemia. This would cause pain. There's increased uterine activity, uterine ischemia as mentioned, and there is sensitization of the nerve terminals to prostaglandins and endoperoxidases. Now, during menses, there's decrease in progesterone, decrease in estrogen, with increase in transcription of both your endometrial collagenases and matrix metalloproteinases, or your MMP. Likewise, there is note of increased inflammatory cytokines. This would cause breakdown of endometrial tissue, freeing the phospholipids from the cellular membrane. Now, with the phospholipase, they convert your free phospholipids to arachidonic acid. There's increased amounts in the endometrium during the ovulatory cycles, and note that your arachidonic acid is precursor of prostaglandins. As mentioned earlier, your PGF2 alpha and PGE2 together with your leukotrienes are increased with myometrial contractions. With the myometrial contractions, this can cause decreased blood flow, ischemia, and sensitization of the pain fibers. Note that endometrial contractions of your PGF2 alpha and PGE2, they correlate with the severity of dysmenorrhea. You have your cyclooxygenase inhibitors. This would decrease menstrual fluid prostaglandin levels and decrease the pain. Your PGF2 alpha and PGE2 affect other organs such as bowel and result in nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, and thus the other systemic symptoms. Note that the diagnosis of dysmenorrhea is made largely by history and physical exam. Again, the diagnosis of primary dysmenorrhea is made largely by history and physical examination. Pelvic ultrasound may be considered or should be considered to evaluate for secondary causes. Okay. As to history, these patients would present with midline, crampy, lower abdominal or suprapubic pain, which usually begins with the onset of menses. The pain gradually resolves over 12, sometimes up to 72 hours. Other patients may also complain of bowel symptoms like diarrhea. The others would complain of headache, fatigue, and body malaise. Physical exam would usually be normal. Laboratory and imaging are usually not done because they're not associated with primary dysmenorrhea. Interestingly mentioned in your textbook was the Canadian 2017 Consensus Guidelines, which presents to you a dysmenorrhea history checklist. You review the menstrual history, the relationship between menarche and the onset of dysmenorrhea symptoms, the timing of pain in relation to menses, and the amount of menstrual flow. You interview to assess characterization, severity, chronology, and resulting disability. Example, if patients cannot go to school or cannot go to work, that's severe their dysmenorrhea. You have sexual history, including inquiry of any history of sexual abuse, inquiry about chronic pain syndromes and medical conditions, evaluate for presence of symptoms of depression, anxiety, or other psychiatric disorders, and review if there's previous treatment, including the dose, the duration of use, and side effects and responses to drugs. Note that treatment of primary dysmenorrhea begins with providing patient education and reassurance. It should be individualized, as supportive therapy can be tailored to the patient's specific symptoms, the degree of disability from those symptoms, and other healthcare considerations, such as, let us say, if there's also need for contraception. So seen on your right would be an algorithm with the review of your primary dysmenorrhea concerns. Maybe recommend your exercise, use of heating pads, NSAIDs. Now, depends if there's request for contraception counseling or use, and then we proceed accordingly. Moreover, there should also be investigation to rule out secondary causes of dysmenorrhea. You do a detailed review of history, a directed physical exam at that, request for a pelvic ultrasound, and if needed, further diagnostics. Investigation supports diagnosis of primary dysmenorrhea and then evaluate for fertility concerns. Now let's go to treatment. Let's start off with the non-pharmacologic interventions. As prescribed earlier, you can prescribe your aerobic exercises. This has been proven in Cochrane studies, physical activity as evaluated by systematic reviews, and many other benefits from exercise likewise warrants its recommendation as the first-line therapy for women suffering from significant dysmenorrhea. As mentioned earlier, likewise, you have heat. You apply it to the lower abdomen in the form of, let's say, a patch, a wrap, and this was effective in reducing dysmenorrhea with no side effects. There are also behavioral interventions that may be encouraged. Behavioral interventions may help reduce your cyclic menstrual pain. Examples of which would be your relaxation training, Lamaze exercises, hypnotherapy, imagery, coping strategies during counseling, and desensitizing procedures. How about vitamins and diet? Well, dietary and vitamin therapies may also be beneficial to decrease the menstrual pain compared with nothing at all. Example, you can prescribe your low-fat vegetarian diet, vitamins E, B1, B6, fish oil supplements or your DHA, your fish oil with B+, ginger. Valerian is a flowering herb, zinc, Japanese herbal combinations as well. Now let's go to medications. You can start off with non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or your NSAIDs. These would serve as first-line therapies for primary dysmenorrhea. You have prostaglandin synthesis inhibitors because prostaglandin is the concern. You have aryl carboxylic acids, your acetyl salicylic acid or your aspirin, your phenamates like your mefenamic acid. You also have your aryl alkanoic acids, your aryl propionic acids like your ibuprofen, naproxen, ketoprofen, and indole acetic acid like your indomethacin. There are stronger drugs like your cyclooxygenase or your COX-2 inhibitors. Example would be your celecoxib. Your COX-2 expression in uterine glandular epithelium is maximum during menstruation. Know that NSAIDs were more substantially effective compared to placebo in terms of pain reduction, but there are side effects. They're usually gastrointestinal and neurologic. Are there any contraindications to NSAIDs? Well, you have nasal polyps, presence of angioedema, bronchospasm, patients with history of chronic ulceration or inflammatory reaction of the upper or lower GI tract, and any previous renal disease. With the use of NSAIDs, we watch out for autoimmune hemolytic anemia, rash, edema, fluid retention, CNS symptoms. They might present with dizziness, headache, nervousness, and blurred vision. Now, aside from NSAIDs, you have your combined contraceptives. You have estrogen and progesterone. This will relieve the symptoms in most patients, more than 90% of patients, as they will suppress ovulation and endometrial proliferation. The progestin component will block precursors to prostaglandin formation. You also have combined oral contraceptives, vaginal ring patches, and transdermals. You have your DMPA or your depot medroxyprogesterone. It's a long-acting injectable contraceptive that has not been studied specifically for primary dysmenorrhea. Your 20 micrograms levonorgestrel releasing IUD system. It is a 19 or testosterone derivative affecting the endometrial progesterone receptors. You have single rod etonogestrel releasing contraceptive. They are long-acting reversible contraceptives as well. The others would give tocolytics because they would block uterine contractility, but it is not usually our first line. Like nifedipine, they said that it can demonstrate pain relief, but there are side effects like facial flushing, tachycardia, and even headache. Your glyceryl nitrates and magnesium, they said that this can reduce cyclic menstrual pain, but it is not really one of our armamentarium. Other treatments. You have narcotic analgesics. They're often used for general chronic pain syndromes, but with potential, of course, for abuse and dependency, and thus they're not used for dysmenorrhea management. In the books, you see transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, or your TENS. It's high intensity and it is more effective compared to placebo, of course, although not as effective as your analgesics. The others would consult for acupuncture and acupressure. These would belong to complementary alternative management. Surgical interruption of nerve pathways, well, this is very interventional. You have laparoscopic uterine nerve ablation, or LUNA, or laparoscopic presacral neurectomy. Now let's go to secondary dysmenorrhea. Know that many other conditions can cause or are associated with dysmenorrhea. Pelvic disease should be considered in patients, more so for those who do not respond to NSAIDs or contraceptives or combination of these agents for the presumed primary dysmenorrhea. For those patients whose symptoms appear after many years of initial painless menses. Pathologic conditions may occur at any age, and in most cases, pain is secondary to the pathologic process of the condition or is a specific result of it. Tabulated on your right would be the causes of secondary dysmenorrhea. You can have gynecologic pathology like cervical stenosis, endometriosis, adenomyosis, PIDs, polyps or fibroids, ovarian cysts or masses, pelvic congestion, and congenital obstructed Müllerian malformations. You can also have non-gynecologic disorders that can cause the pelvic pain. Example, mental health issues or disorders, bowel disease, urinary tract disease. Let's start off with one concern. That would be cervical stenosis. This is defined as the severe narrowing of the cervical canal, particularly at the level of the internal os, and this would impede menstrual flow, resulting to increase in intrauterine pressure during the time of menses, and then pelvic pain. The etiology, it can be congenital, but your stenosis may also be secondary to cervical injury after an electrocautery, a cryocautery procedure, or operative trauma. It may also result secondary to an inflammatory process, secondary to an infection, an application of a caustic substance, or if there is hypoestrogenism. How would these patients present? For cervical stenosis, they present with history of scant menstrual flow, severe cramping that continues throughout the menstrual period, and on diagnostic, let's say your ultrasound, you will see hematometra or pyometra may occur. That is blood accumulation within the uterus or abscess within the uterus. The diagnosis on speculum exam, you see that the external os appears to be scarred, and on clinical manipulation, it is impossible to pass a cervical brush or uterine sound or dilator through the internal os, and this can be verified on hysterosalpingogram or hysteroscopy. Note that the management should be to dilate the cervix, and we can accomplish this through DNC or dilatation and curettage with use also of progressive dilators or by use of laminaria tents. We watch out for the recurrence, and patients would sometimes need repeated procedures. Pregnancy and vaginal delivery would often afford also a more lasting cure. You can also have endometriosis as a cause of dysmenorrhea. The presence of endometrial glands and stroma outside the uterus is the definition for endometriosis. It is a chronic condition. They manifest with generalized pelvic pain, cyclic pain, dysmenorrhea, dyspareunia, infertility, and the others as severe as bowel or bladder dysfunction. As to epidemiology, it can affect 6 to 10% of reproductive age women. 70 to 80% present with CPP or your chronic pelvic pain. It's seen in 1/3 of women who are undergoing diagnostic laparoscopy for chronic pelvic pain, and it is confirmed by visualization of the endometriotic implants and by biopsy. The most common cause of secondary Secondary dysmenorrhea among adolescents would be endometriosis. This should be considered when there is a history of pain becoming more severe during the menses. Pertinent PE findings would include uterosacral ligament nodules. They're as small as rosary beads on palpation, evidence of endometriosis in the vagina or cervix that would be endometriotic implants of varied colors. It can range from black to bluish violet and sometimes red. There would be lateral displacement on the cervix on internal examination. Diagnostics, you can have a pelvic ultrasound and of course on diagnostic laparoscopy. You also have adenomyosis. It is defined as the presence of endometrial glands and stroma in the myometrium. Ectopic endometrial tissue may induce hypertrophy and hyperplasia of the adjacent myometrium. On ultrasound, it would be shown as thickening of the myometrium. Clinical presentation would be heavy, painful menses that tends to be progressive, and they have bulk symptoms because the uterus enlarges. Experiments show that on tissue slices of endometriotic implants, they showed significantly higher prostaglandin levels than in the normal endometrium, myometrium, leiomyomas, and normal ovarian tissue. They produce larger amounts of your 6-keto PGF1 when there is severe dysmenorrhea. There is also pelvic inflammation. Pelvic infections may be secondary to gonorrhea, chlamydia, or other microbes. They can cause pelvic inflammation. The others would even have pelvic abscess. This would lead to pelvic adhesions, tubal damage, and eventually pelvic pain. You have your pelvic inflammatory disease or your PID. This can lead to chronic pelvic pain in up to more than 30% of women. Infection secondary to other conditions like appendicitis or previous IUD use with infection that can cause also pelvic inflammation. The pathophysiology of pain is secondary to the congestion and the edema that normally occurs during menses and is further aggravated by current infection or healed inflammatory areas and adhesions. You can have other structural abnormalities. So even if those who do not really cause isolated dysmenorrhea, but the following should be considered as differential diagnosis. Example, lesions of the uterus like fibroids or what you call your myomas, polyps, lesions of the ovaries like cysts or masses. How do we diagnose this? You can do this on pelvic exam, carry out an ultrasound, facilitate a hysteroscopy, and on saline infusion sonography. You also have your pelvic congestion syndrome. This is defined as one that results from engorgement of the pelvic vasculature. It's a poorly understood disorder of ventilation. There is chronic pelvic discomfort, often described as burning or throbbing in nature, that is worsened by prolonged standing and sometimes by intercourse among women who have peri-ovarian varicosities on imaging studies. Etiology is unclear and the treatment is uncertain. On physical exam, the vagina and the cervix may reveal vasocongestion. There would be uterine enlargement on bimanual palpation, and there's global tenderness of the cervix, uterus, and an annexal area on palpation. Diagnostics we can carry out a pelvic ultrasound, venography, a CT, or an MRI, and on laparoscopy, this would rule out other causes of pelvic pain. And on laparoscopy, you would be able to demonstrate the congestion of the uterus and engorgements or prominence of these varicosities of the broad ligament and pelvic sidewall veins. Treatment, there's no standard therapeutic approach that is available, although mentioned would be to opt for ovarian hormone suppression, sclerotherapy for the vulvar varices, embolization of the hypogastric vein, resection of the gonadal vein, or hysterectomy. Progestins and your gonadotropin-releasing hormones, or your GnRH, would be effective in decreasing pain symptoms based on systematic reviews. For congenital obstructive concerns, congenital obstructive anomalies of the reproductive tract would include anomalies of the hymen, the vagina, Eulerian anomalies of the uterus. It can occur in up to 3.8% of young women. This can be evaluated through physical exam and sometimes necessitates examination under anesthesia for the younger patients. Imaging. The goal would be, of course, surgical correction. You want to create a patent outflow tract to relieve the symptoms. There are non-gynecologic causes, as tabulated earlier. You can have mental health conditions. This is conditioned behavior secondary to strong family history of dysmenorrhea, or if with societal reward or control because of the symptoms of pain. Chronic non-pelvic pain is a general risk factor for chronic pelvic pain. So here we have conditions that may manifest in chronic pelvic pain and dysmenorrhea: somatization, opiate dependency, history of physical or sexual abuse, and depression. Women with chronic pelvic pain often have psychological issues as well. There's need for careful evaluation of past and present social situation. You can administer a depression screen, perform mental status exam, and refer to mental health providers for further diagnostic testing, counseling, and or medical therapy. You can have also functional bowel disease. This is abdominal pain with altered bowel function and can occur in 61% of women who present with dysmenorrhea. They would also have bowel symptoms that were significantly correlated with pain during menses, even after controlling for the effects of neuroticism. Adolescents with IBS or your irritable bowel syndrome can also have significantly higher rates of primary dysmenorrhea and PMS or your premenstrual syndrome. So women, patients with IBS who took COCs reported significantly less dysmenorrhea. Other causes can be appendicitis, lactose intolerance, celiac screw, abdominal mass, urinary tract conditions like a urinary tract infection, painful bladder syndrome, cystitis, nephrolithiasis, and ureteral obstruction. Now let's go to premenstrual syndrome and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Premenstrual syndrome is a group of mild to moderate symptoms, physical and behavioral, that occur in the second half of the menstrual cycle or your luteal phase, and that may interfere with work and personal relationships. So what are the common complaints? They complain of breast tenderness, bloating, and headache. What are the common behavioral symptoms? You have irritability, they're anxious. Sometimes they present with depression, followed by a period entirely free of symptoms. How about the definition for your PMDD or your premenstrual dysphoric disorder? This represents a more severe disorder with marked behavioral and emotional symptoms. Technically, your PMDD is included in the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or your DSM-5. Your PMDD differs from PMS in terms of the severity of symptoms and the fact that women with PMDD must have at least one severe affective symptom that occurs regularly during the last week of the luteal phase in most menstrual cycles. They have substantial impairment in personal functioning compared to a PMS. Note that your PMS and PMDD are similar in that the symptoms manifest in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, that is the second half, and resolves during menses. I'd like to share with you the diagnostic criteria for your premenstrual dysphoric disorder under DSM-5. To continue, let's discuss incidence and epidemiology. Premenstrual syndromes occur in 75% of women and at some point in their reproductive lives. The incidence of clinically relevant premenstrual syndrome occurs in 3 to 8% of women. The incidence of PMDD, of course, is less using the DSM-5 criteria, and the average age of onset will be about 26 years. Let us discuss the risk factors for premenstrual syndrome or your PMS. Check if there's family history of PMS in the mother, any personal past or current psychiatric illness or concern involving mood or anxiety disorders, history of alcohol abuse, history of postpartum depression, nulliparity, early menarche, those patients with high caffeine intake, high levels of stress, and high body mass index. The risk factors for PMDD, your lower education, any history of major depression, and those who are smokers. Symptoms. Most common somatic symptoms would be abdominal bloating, breast tenderness, and various pain constellations. They start off usually with headache. Psychological symptoms may vary. They present with fatigue, irritability, tension, anxiety, a labile mood at that, and depression. What are the causes? Estrogen excess, an imbalance of both estrogen and progesterone, any endogenous hormone allergy, hypoglycemia, vitamin B6 deficiency, prolactin excess, fluid retention, inappropriate prostaglandin activity, elevated monoamine oxidase or your MAO levels, endorphin malfunction, and a number of psychological disturbances. So here is a diagrammatic representation of the proposed causes of your PMS and your PMDD. Start off with ovarian steroid fluctuation. As mentioned earlier, the concerns on steroids. Normal cyclic changes in ovarian steroids cause dramatic changes in various body systems. You have CNS neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitter levels are affected by ovarian steroid changes, and the sterotogenic, adrenergic, opioid, and GABAergic systems are all implicated. They say that there is genetic predisposition. There's development or severity of PMS symptoms based on heredity. Social expectations, well, social cultural beliefs about menstruation may also influence what the woman expects or experiences. PMS is a multifactorial psychoendocrine disorder. Cyclic gonadal hormonal alterations and serotonergic neuronal mechanisms in the CNS may interact, and this can be major causative factors for PMS in susceptible women. You have beta endorphins and your gamma aminobutyric acid or GABA neurotransmitters. They have also been implicated. Estrogen modulates these neurotransmitters like your GABA and dopamine, and they serve as inhibitory or excitatory agents in the brain. The cause of PMS and PMDD is associated with ovarian steroids and ovulation, which seem to produce alterations in the neurohormones and neurotransmitters as discussed. This leads to a reduction of serotonergic function during the luteal phase. Most effective treatments for moderate or severe PMS or PMDD symptoms are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or your SSRIs and agents that block ovulation. These are all evidence-based. Temporal relationship between menstrual phase, PMS, and PMDD symptoms suggests that there is indeed a role for reproductive hormones. Beta endorphin, gamma, the autonomic nervous system, and social expectations may all play a role in these complex disorders. As to diagnosis, the diagnosis of PMS and PMDD is made by history of 2 consecutive menstrual cycles demonstrating luteal phase symptoms of PMS and PMDD. History and physical exam should rule out any medical problems that can influence the symptoms. Blood tests are of limited utility. The others would just request for a TSH maybe to screen for any thyroid disease. Note that a number of validated tools with diary sheets and symptom checklists are also available. Example of which would be a daily record of severity of problems that is most commonly used and presented during consult. According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they define PMS as the presence of at least one symptom during the luteal phase of the cycle, leading to significant impairment in function. Diagnosis can be difficult because women with depression and anxiety disorders can have premenstrual exacerbation of their symptoms, and PMS and PMDD also coexist with psychiatric disorders. On the table on your right, you see considerations in the differential diagnosis of premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Of course, one would be PMS. You also have endometriosis, dysmenorrhea, premenstrual exacerbations, autoimmune disorders, diabetes, anemia. As mentioned earlier, if they want to test for TSH, they want to check for hypothyroidism, psychiatric disorders, depression, anxiety, dysthymic disorder, and a bipolar disorder. Other conditions that one should consider based on patient symptoms should also include anemia, diabetes, endometriosis, autoimmune disorders, chronic fatigue syndrome, collagen vascular disorders, psychiatric disorders like depression, anxiety, dysthymia, and bipolar disorder. Therefore, the diagnosis of your premenstrual syndrome is made by symptom diary and by elimination of other diagnoses. The diagnosis of PMDD is made after the DSM-5 criteria, which would require 5 of the 11 symptoms listed of PMS, including one affective symptom. These symptoms should be occurring for most of the preceding year. Prospective menstrual cycle charting is required for the diagnosis during consultation. What are the affective symptoms? These would include those who would complain of feeling sad or hopeless, having self-depreciating thoughts, those who present with anxiety, tension, those with labile moods and consistent crying, persistent irritability. They also present with anger and increased interpersonal conflicts. What can be the management or treatment? You start off with diet. You increase complex carbohydrate intake. This can reduce severity of the PMS mood symptoms, increase tryptophan availability, thus increase the serotonin. You reduce or eliminate sugar, alcohol, caffeine, salty foods, and red meat. During the PMS concerns, you address cravings because there's increased appetite, mood changes, sleep disturbance, irritability, and bloating with fluid retention. How about supplements? You can prescribe calcium at 1,200 milligram per day for 3 cycles or 3 months. Pyridoxine or your vitamin B6 for a dose of 50 milligram per day up to as high as 200 milligrams per day. This is involved in the biosynthesis of dopamine and serotonin in neurotransmitters. Note, however, that with vitamin B6, you can have side effects of sensory deficit, paresthesia, numbness, ataxia, and muscle weakness. Magnesium can also be prescribed at a dose of 200 to 400 milligrams per day. Exercise would be easier. Exercise for at least 30 minutes on most days of the week, of course, especially during the luteal phase or the second half of the cycle. These are when the symptoms are present. High-intensity aerobic exercise seems to be superior compared to your low-intensity aerobic exercises based on studies. Lifestyle change. We reassure these women that PMS is a common problem. Lifestyle change tailored to symptomatic needs should be recommended. This is recommended for 2 months while the woman completes the prospective diary of symptoms for diagnosis. We advise patients to avoid stressful activities during the luteal phase and, of course, have enough sleep. There are other adjunct treatments or what you call as your CAMS, complementary alternative medicine. Other patients would involve themselves into massage, biofeedback, yoga, acupuncture, chiropractic manipulation. The others would take evening primrose oil, Chinese herbal meds, and bright light therapy because this may increase serotonin. It's an option for PMDDs. You can also ask your patients to involve themselves in cognitive behavioral therapy, like psychotherapy. This would be a psychoeducation group management for your PMS symptoms. You can have relaxation therapy. This is beneficial for those with significant stress and anxiety. And then you have pharmacologic agents. You have psychoactive drugs. We start off with your selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors or your SSRIs. These have been shown to be extremely effective for treating PMS and have become the first-line treatment for PMDD. Examples would be your paroxetine, sertraline, escitalopram, fluoxetine, citalopram. If taken as continuous or luteal phase SSRIs, they're both effective for PMS. When you say luteal phase SSRIs, they're taken during the second half of the cycle. They're started on cycle day 14 and continued until the onset of menses or even for a few more days after. If luteal phase SSRI treatment is not effective after 3 months, then a trial of continuous, meaning whole month SSRIs is warranted. If no one SSRI was demonstrated to be better than another, but if one is ineffective, you can try other agents that may still be effective. SSRIs are effective in 60% of PMS sufferers. It has side effects likewise. Examples would be sexual dysfunction or anorgasmia, sleep alterations, GI distress. They complain of nausea, CNS complaints like headache, jitteriness, anxiety reaction. Interestingly, there were reports of increased suicide rate, and thus caution is mandated if with significant depressive symptoms for the patients. You have alprazolam or your Xanax. This significantly relieves the severity of PMS, tension, mood swings, irritability, anxiety, depression, fatigue, forgetfulness, crying, craving for sweets, abdominal bloating, cramps, and headache, of course, compared to placebo. Alprazolam may be effective for depressive and anxiety symptoms than for the PMS complaints. That's why this is just a second-line treatment compared to your SSRIs. Side effects of your Xanax, drowsiness and sedation, and also this one is prone to habituation. Your buspirone is less addictive potential than alprazolam. Tricyclics and lithium, based on studies, did not yield good PMS symptoms relief. You can have or carry out hormonal suppression. With progesterone, progestin therapy seems to not show significant improvement for PMS. But if you take a look at oral contraceptives, they're likely beneficial because they inhibit ovulation, breast pain, bloating, acne, and appetite. If you have a combination of your 30 micrograms or of ethinyl estradiol with 3 milligrams risperidone, based on studies, this combination significantly reduced the PMS symptoms compared to your regular typical cyclic oral contraceptives. For women with PMS and PMDD who also desire contraception, of course, your oral contraceptives would be a reasonable first-line therapy. Again, you can also use your NSAIDs for cramping, aches, diarrhea, or heat intolerance. Mefenamic acid and naproxen for pain, mood, and somatic symptoms have been used. Diuretics. They are potassium-sparing diuretics for bloating and fluid retention. This may be used during the luteal phase, but there are mixed studies with regards to its efficacy. Example of your diuretic would be your spironolactone at 100 milligram per day, especially for those who complain of breast tenderness, fluid retention, and irritability symptoms. Note that your diuretics are avoided in patients with chronic renal disease or if patients present with diarrhea symptoms also and other fluid loss. Now, there are patients who complain of cyclic mastalgia or breast pain. Bromocriptine would be helpful for this symptom. It's given at 5 milligram per day during the luteal phase. You have hormonal suppression, gonadal releasing hormone agonists or your GnRH agonists. They're effective for ovulation suppression and treatment of your premenstrual syndrome and physical symptoms of your PMDD. It is less effective in treating psychiatric symptoms of the PMDD. It can also have side effects like hypoestrogenism and osteoporosis. There is a need to use add back estrogen and progesterone so that it can offset the hypoestrogenic side effects without aggravating further the PMS and the PMDD symptoms. Surgical treatment. Well, it is not offered as a standard therapy. It may be considered for women with severe disabling symptoms who have been refractory to other medical therapies, and of course, if they have completed family size. Procedures can include bilateral oophorectomy with or without the hysterectomy. The others would use GnRH agonists for 3 to 6 months with or without estrogen add back, demonstrating efficacy. This is important before determining really if the patient would really benefit from a surgical treatment. So with that, that ends our lecture for a coverage of technically 2 topics. Are there any questions or concerns? The lecture, I hope, has already been uploaded into your Canvas. They have been appropriately outlined and highlighted accordingly. So note that you have the links to the evaluation of the lecture, and they should be filled out twice because a lecture follows mine. If there are no other concerns or questions, I hope it would have been beneficial likewise to personal experience on dysmenorrhea and likewise your premenstrual syndrome. If there are no other concerns, I wish you all a good day. Good luck in your exams. Thank you.